This is the Grimm Sleeper, Joshua D. Maley, and host of Grimm's Frightmares. I've always loved museums. They're a gateway to the past. They connect us with our roots. They teach us about who we were and who we could become. The ghosts of our past haunt every display and every exhibit. And sometimes, that's more than just a metaphor. Tonight's tale is plucked from downtown Pittsburgh, in a museum where the past is still very much alive. We all know people who have a hard time letting go of things. And the same is true in tonight's tale of terror. She couldn't let go. There's a museum near downtown Pittsburgh that has a very rich historical exhibit. When the city was first being built, it was home to countless immigrants trying to forge lives for themselves. The exhibits at the Heinz History Center are home to the memories of those days long past. But for some, those days long past are every bit as real as the present. It was my junior year of high school, and our history teacher decided a trip to this historical museum would be a benefit. I was somewhat disappointed when we arrived. Being the nerd that I was, I had anticipated a grand old building with sweeping ivory columns and a million steps leading up to some sprawling, golden trim front doors. What I saw, however, was a rundown red brick building sitting all by itself in the middle of a deserted parking lot that was full of rubble and quickly growing weeds. The building itself appeared more antiquated than the contents I had guessed were inside. Museum indeed. It was more like a slum. What little hope I had held out quickly faded as we stepped inside. Most of the building's original interior had been replaced. New walls, new floors, new everything. It had a very artificial feel to it. After listening to some drabble from the museum manager, we were led up to the second floor of the museum, passing by several mock-up, old-styled airplanes, cars, and trolleys. We were brought then into a large room, which was home to a wall-to-wall mural of Pittsburgh's cultural history. All nationalities were represented somewhere in a vast sea of people that surrounded us on all four walls. They represented the men and women who had founded the city, the first settlers who had laid every brick, stone, and wooden plank by hand. The mural was poorly done, to be honest. It had a very cartoon-like feel. It, like everything else thus far on the tour, was painfully artificial. I was more than bored. Surely this sad excuse for a field trip couldn't be any better or worse than sitting around in classrooms all day long. Instead of listening to the droning of our teachers, we stood listening to the droning of an adorable but far too perky tour guide named Jenna. Honestly, I imagine she could have found work elsewhere, if for no other reason than the captivating smile she occasionally graced us with when one of us, me usually, would crack a joke. I had all but given up hope on anything interesting happening during this trip. We came to the point where we were sitting in a tiny circular room and being treated to a video of B-grade actors and actresses portraying the city founders. What nonsense, I had thought. Being an amateur theater and film director myself, I found this narrative on the city's early days to be poorly done, cheesy, with a distinct lack of any kind of cohesiveness. My head pounded as if it longed to separate itself from my body. I pressed onward, growing more irritable by the second. But my endurance would soon pay off. Our next stop, Hollywood. Or at least it could have been. We arrived on a floor that could very easily have been the set to a movie. All around, springing up from the ground like a great brick and steel forest, was an exact recreation of the Pittsburgh of yesteryear. I marveled at the detail put into recreating this handful of old downtown streets and buildings that made up the floor's display. The tops of the buildings rose up into a shroud of darkness I could only assume was a tarp or a curtain, designed to give the impression of late evening or night, depending on the lighting conditions. This was impressive enough, but add to it the dozen or so actors and actresses that were portraying people straight out of the history books, and the illusion was complete. I was in awe, instantly thinking of 100 different scenes and 100 different stories that could have taken place on these very streets. Hell, that probably did take place on those very streets. There was something about the floor that drew me in, and I was hooked. My earlier frustration was gone, transformed into a deep respect and quiet awe for the mastermind behind this incredible piece of historical work. The exteriors were tremendous, but inside each building was a 1- or 2-room interior that was every bit as real and vivid as the house I lived in. Stores, law offices, apartment buildings of all kinds were brought to vivid life both inside and out. A small house on a street corner caught my eye, and I stepped inside. It was darker than the others, and an eerie light emanated from somewhere within. The air in the entry room was stale and warm, nothing like the cool, air-conditioned temperatures of the other rooms. The walls appeared to be genuine wood, and the ambience in the room was haunting. There was a thick silence about the place, as if the silence were a tangible presence that could be felt. I swear I could hear my heart beating more rapidly as I went deeper into the room. When I turned the corner, I was somewhat startled to find an old woman sitting in a rocking chair next to an old wooden coffin. She seemed to be sobbing silently. She acknowledged me only for the briefest of moments, then dabbed her damp eyes with a towel and returned her gaze to the wooden box. Intrigued, I moved to the coffin without much thought and inadvertently blocked her view. The coffin was remarkably realistic. Every line, nook, and cranny was painstakingly crafted to historic perfection. A plaque was mounted on the wall next to the coffin that explained exactly what it was doing in someone's living room. Apparently, in those days, funerals took place inside the deceased person's home. The body could be there for days or even weeks until funeral services had concluded and the burial could be arranged. This particular coffin lid was open, and inside rested the disturbing likeness of a young boy. The mannequin looked remarkably real. So great was the detail, I could have sworn I saw small marks in the plastic that looked like moles, scars, or other skin blemishes. I was racked with chills and surprise that such a disturbing image would be made public in a family museum like this. My gaze lingered on the mannequin a second too long, and I suddenly grew very anxious. As I turned away, I found myself staring into the face of the woman. Her features were pale, her eyes were sunken, and wrinkles creased her brow. There's something about her that seemed different from the other actors, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. It was as if this deep grief had permeated her every feature. It was chilling. I could only stare. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. I could read the words she was trying to speak, and deep in my mind, I swear, I heard a rasping voice vomiting the word out. Move. 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 Her grief was so deep, so profound and overwhelming. My own mind cried out for release from whatever it was that burdened her so. I could only stare blankly, suffering from paralysis, both mental and physical. When I finally did regain control of my legs, I stepped aside, giving the woman a clear view of the coffin once more. She blinked at me and returned to her seat, resuming her earlier posture and dabbing her eyes occasionally with the towel. The woman looked at the child with such a deep, desperate longing, I nearly wept with her. I turned to leave, unable to believe how amazing this actress was. Surely she deserved some kind of an award. I slipped out of the building and quickly rejoined my group, my heart still pounding in my chest. The rest of the tour went by in a blur. I could think of nothing else but the haunting woman in this house and the eerily realistic child in the coffin. As the tour wrapped up, we headed back down to the floor with the city street exhibits. The actors had all left for the day, so the streets were empty. It truly seemed as if the city was asleep. I decided to return to the house with the coffin, but was surprised to find it roped off. All of the lights were out in that area. The tour guide approached me and once again flashed her award-winning smile.
Sorry, that one is closed off.
When did it close? I asked, curious as to what could have happened in the short amount of time we had been away.
Right after it opened. Care to see?
Without waiting for an answer, she removed the rope and motioned for me to follow her. We entered the room I had been in only hours before. A layer of dust occupied almost every surface, including the coffin, which was now closed. Right after it opened today, you mean? I asked. The girl gave me a puzzled look.
This exhibit has been closed for months. It was shut down the day after it opened.
That's not possible. I was just down here a little bit ago. There was an actress sitting right there in the chair. I pointed to the chair. The towel the woman had been using hung over the back of it. There, that towel. She was using that towel. I grabbed the towel and dropped it. The thing was dry and crisp. Obviously, it hadn't seen any water in many months. Probably longer. What's going on? This should be wet. And the coffin was open. There was a mannequin inside.
The coffin is nailed shut. It's never been opened.
I examined the nails. Sure enough, they were ancient and rusted in place. But it had been open. I'd seen it open. Where did this come from? I asked. It was all I could get out. The girl moved to a table and picked up an old dusty picture and handed it to me. I looked at it and nearly dropped it. Staring back at me in the picture was the woman I had seen earlier, and a young boy, about 4 years old, sitting on her lap. What is this?
It came in with the rest of this stuff. They found an old cabin in Squirrel Hill. Almost everything in this room came from there.
Cold realization settled upon me as my eyes found the wooden box once more. Even the coffin? She nodded. A real coffin, found in an old cabin, and it had never been opened. My stomach churned at the implication of what was really in that box. Jenna went on to explain that the exhibit was closed because the workers were too terrified to complete the scene. She pointed out an incomplete wall above the rocking chair, a wall that I had seen completely intact only hours before. Many of the workers reported seeing something similar to what I had seen. An old woman with sad features grieving over the open coffin. The woman had grown quite violent initially. She never actually spoke, but her mouth moved. She shook her cloth at people and frightened them enough to chase them away. The plans for the exhibit were shut down after that, and nothing had been done with the section since then. My mind was spinning. This was impossible. Could it have been that the woman I saw in the chair was dead? That the child in the coffin had been real? I asked the girl why the creators of the museum would put such a dreadful exhibit on display in the first place.
Realism, I guess. Or maybe the shock value of it all. I've never seen anything in here, so I really don't know if any of that stuff is true.
It's true, I thought, terrified beyond the capacity for words. I suddenly felt dizzy and leaned against the closest thing I could find for support. Unfortunately, in this case, that was the coffin. It slid easily off its stand under my bulk and landed sideways on the floor with a sickening crack. The rusted nails shattered under the shock, and the lid to the coffin tumbled open. Instantly, the lantern on the fireplace snapped to life, illuminating the room with dancing shadows. Hesitantly, Jenna and I peeked at the now open coffin. The grotesque, decomposed corpse of a small child stared at us through empty eye sockets. We screamed in terror and fled the room. So far as I know, Jenna never went back to work there, and I never returned. The rest of the exhibit was torn down quickly thereafter, and a new display was put up in its place. Jenna believes the staff was told never to speak publicly about the goings-on. The museum had officially denied that the coffin came from an actual cabin, or that it was in any way real. Jenna and I know better, though. We know where the pieces of that exhibit came from. And we also know that next time, the museum will be a little more careful about where it gets its displays from. If you enjoyed this story, please be sure to subscribe below, and check out our other offerings here at Grimm Scary Tales. You can also find us on other social media. Just click the links on your screen. If you have a story you'd like to hear us read, click on the link to submit a story and tell us all about your own personal Frightmare. Thanks for listening.